irritating. We're going to talk today about the Galileo problem. Because when you talk about Galileo, you're talking about a whole series of problems, a whole series of questions that come up. For one thing, everybody knows about the problems that the church had with Galileo. Why did the church have a problem with Galileo? Why did the church even care whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun? What were the theological issues that they thought were at stake? And what were the issues behind the issues that made these so important for the people of the time? In addition, when you talk about Galileo, you're faced with some historical questions. Galileo was supporting the Copernican system, and the Copernican system had been around for 75 years before it became an issue with Galileo. Why did it take 75 years before anybody thought there might be a theological issue there? Galileo goes on trial in 1616. Everybody involved in the Copernican system has their books put on the index, except Galileo. He gets off scot-free. How come? Why did that happen? In fact, for the next 20 years, he publishes, and he goes on the talk show circuit, going to the salons of all the rich and famous of Florence and Rome. And then, in 1632, having his best friend as the Pope, suddenly everything collapses on him. What happened? What happened in 1632 that suddenly it all was a disaster? He winds up in house arrest. And then, when he goes back to his house arrest, he writes his greatest work of physics and gets it published in the Protestant North, with correspondence going back and forth and representatives coming to visit him, and nobody seems to find a problem with that. Hello? What's going on? How did that happen? When we talk about Galileo, I think there's also a sense of our own current issues, our own current problems. What can we learn about the Galileo affair? How did Galileo become a symbol of church science problems? What does the Galileo affair tell us about the nature of the church and the nature of science? Do we know anything better now than we did in Galileo's time? Could it happen again? These are the problems that we're going to address in this series of talks. I want to talk about who Galileo was. I want to talk about what Galileo meant. And I want to talk about what Galileo means to me. The reason it comes up in my life is that I'm a scientist, and I'm also a Jesuit brother. I work at the Vatican, and I work with astronomers. Part of my job is to referee, to look over books that are going to be published. And I had one just across my desk a couple of months ago. That wonderful book, I gave it generally high reviews, but it had this marvelous paragraph looking into the history of astronomy, where the author says, Copernicus proposed his sun-centered theory of planetary motion in 1543, radically challenging the all-powerful Catholic Church's view of the universe. Astronomers ignored his theory for decades, in part because heresy could be suicidal. Copernicus did publish his book in 1543. The all-powerful Catholic Church? 1543 was the height of the Protestant Reformation. If anything, that's when the church was at its weakest. Astronomers ignoring his theory? They didn't ignore his theory. Copernicus was actually used in the reform of the calendar by the Pope 40 years later. Heresy could be suicidal? Is that really how people lived in those days? Let's take a look. When I was teaching astronomy for non-majors, the course we used to call Moons for Goons, I was using an astronomy book that's quite popular that had a number of things to say about Galileo. It says, Italy was no place to introduce unorthodox ideas that might challenge church teachings. Is that actually true? Was there no one else but Galileo suggesting unorthodox ideas? He says, in 1616, when Cardinal Bellarmine interviewed Galileo and ordered him to end his astronomical work, books relevant to Copernicanism were banned, including Copernicus's book on the revolutions. Actually, it wasn't banned. Actually, what happened to that book is a lot more interesting than being banned, because it continued to be used in classrooms for the next 100 years.